COVID-19 shots are on the way here, but that are the same as Pfizer-BioNTech vaccines, but with a different name. Travelers arriving from high-risk countries and regions can look forward to shorter SHNs from tonight. And what lessons can we learn from MAID abuse cases? We'll be speaking to the Executive Director of the Centre for Domestic Employees. Hello, I'm Olivia Quay. You're watching The Big Story live in the Straits Times newsroom. You can subscribe to our channel so you never miss a single episode. Singapore will receive a batch of COVID-19 vaccines called Comirnaty, and the Health Ministry says these are the same as the ones from Pfizer-BioNTech already used here. From research name to manufacturing processes and procedures, as well as the finished product specifications, everything between Comirnaty and Pfizer's vaccines are the same. The only difference is the label, and this is because the Pfizer vaccine used in Singapore is manufactured at various sites across Europe and labeled according to the regulatory approval in the various markets. Health Hub records here of those who have gotten or will be getting either vaccine will have an adjusted label of Pfizer-BioNTech/Comirnaty. 22 new COVID-19 cases confirmed today, 9 imported and 13 locally transmitted. 10 of the local cases are linked and 3 currently unlinked. More details will be released later tonight. 2 new clusters were announced yesterday, one at 90 Red Hill Close and the other is linked to a foreign domestic worker who tested positive on June 14th. An update on our border controls starting at 11:59 p.m. tonight. All travellers arriving from high-risk areas will now be on a 14-day stay-home notice at dedicated facilities instead of 21 days. This comes as MOH says that while there is increased transmissibility with the new variants of concern, it found no evidence that these variants come with longer incubation periods. Travellers must also self-administer an antigen rapid test on the 3rd, 7th and 11th day after arriving. And this is on top of the 2 PCR tests they'll take on arrival and on the 14th day. This new testing requirement will take effect from the night of June the 27th. Meanwhile, Foreign Affairs Minister Vivian Balakrishnan said that in the next few months, Singapore and Vietnam are looking at gradually relaxing travel curbs for business and trips to selected tourist sites. Such plans will depend on how fast Vietnam can vaccinate its population, with only about 2% inoculated so far. And India has declared a new variant to be of concern, identified locally as Delta Plus. It was found in at least 22 cases in 3 states. Meanwhile, the country today reported over 50,800 new infections over the past 24 hours. According to an internal security department report out today, the terrorism threat to Singapore remains high, with terror groups spreading their influence online amid the pandemic. Although there is currently no specific or credible intelligence that points to an imminent attack on Singapore, ISD noted that it had averted attacks by 2 Singaporean youths. We'll talk more about that in a short while. Domestically, the terror threat stems mostly from self-radicalized individuals influenced by violent materials online. Since 2015, out of the 54 people dealt with under the Internal Security Act, 44 were self-radicalized, 32 were Singaporeans, 12 foreigners. Meanwhile, cases of radicalization continue to surface among foreigners here. None of those investigated had any plans to conduct attacks in Singapore, but their radicalization and association with terrorists overseas still pose a security threat. Since 2015, over 40 Bangladeshi workers in Singapore were found to have been radicalized. Except for one currently detained, the others have all been repatriated. Since 2015 as well, 21 foreign domestic workers were found to have been radicalized, 20 have been repatriated, while the remaining worker is still serving her imprisonment term. In 2020, 3 Malaysian workers were found to be radicalized, bringing the total number of radicalized Malaysians repatriated since 2018 to 6. Let's discuss the report's findings with journalist at the Straits Times, Haris Baharuddin. Well, Haris, it's the third edition of this ISD report, which is released every 2 years. What are the overarching trends or key changes between this edition and the previous two?
So, a couple of things. The reports have consistently said that the terror threat to Singapore is high and has remained high. Now, this doesn't mean that terror attacks are happening all the time here. Thankfully, they're not. But what it does mean is that the potential for such attacks is there, and that members of the public have to continually remain vigilant and on a high alert. The ISD has said in this report, as well as in others that it has issued, that there is no specific or credible intelligence that points to an imminent terror attack here. But, as the common saying goes, it's a matter of if and not when. So by saying that the terror threat remains high, it's clear that the message is to not let all our guards down. And I think, secondly, what has remained consistent between the reports is how self-radicalization remains as the biggest threat to Singapore. Domestically, most of the terror threat stems from self-radicalized people, that is, people who are influenced by violent materials online. So ISD has said that since 2015, 44 out of 45 people who have been dealt with under the ISA were self-radicalized.
Yep.
So if we zoom in a bit and look at things more recently, 9 in 10 since 2019 were self-radicalized, with many of them being influenced by groups far away, some of them who many have thought to have been defeated. It shows that the threat of self-radicalization is not going away anytime soon, and we will have to be on alert for this for some time to come.
Right. Well, there have also been 2 high-profile cases of thwarted terror plots by people acting alone. The 16-year-old who wanted to kill worshippers at 2 mosques and the 20-year-old who had planned to attack Jews at the Megan Abbott synagogue. So, Haris, what did the report highlight about such lone wolf threats?
So yes, these lone wolf threats are self-radicalized people, as we had talked about earlier. Now, in both these cases, not only did they involve young and very impressionable people, which is very concerning, but ISD also highlighted how easily obtainable weapons and tactics were used to plan these attacks. These were not big or complicated tactics we're talking about here. The 16-year-old that you mentioned had planned to drive between the 2 mosques he planned to attack using a rented car, which he planned to obtain after he stole his father's credit card. So he and the 20-year-old Amirul, who is the other guy you mentioned, had both planned to use very simple knives to attack, with the latter even practicing stabbing with the knife he obtained after studying a diagram of the human vascular system to identify the best place to stab his victims so that he can inflict a quick death from massive internal bleeding. This is indicative of a trend that terrorism experts have noted that in recent years, where easily available means like knives and vehicles have been used for terror attacks.
Well, still on the self-radicalization cases, the report found that, many are related to ISIS or the Syrian conflict. That being said, though, Singapore isn't immune to other forms of extremist ideologies and influences. What is the extent of the threat of far-right extremism?
So you're right, Olivia. While Islamist terrorism remains a key and primary concern for Singapore, far-right extremism is an emerging threat as well. This form of extremism espouses racial supremacy and anti-Islam and anti-immigration ideas. And the ISD has noted that this has emerged as a major concern overseas and is the fastest growing threat in some Western countries. So these far-right extremist groups have reportedly become much more organized and are capable of mounting attacks. At the same time, there's a concern too that the violence that they enact or that they start could provoke sort of retaliation or retaliatory attacks from Islamist terrorist groups too. So of the 2 potential lone wolf attacks that the department foiled that we discussed earlier, the one involving the 16-year-old was the first case of a detainee to be influenced by far-right extremist ideology. But, you know, as ISD has said, while Singapore has not seen widespread expressions of such beliefs, Islamophobia in such cases still generally remains sporadic here, but this does not mean that Singapore is immune to them.
Yep.
You know, especially in this day and age where such rhetoric is very prevalent on social media, if you know where to look, especially.
Well, Haris, thank you so much for helping us break down the ISD report. That was my colleague, journalist Haris Baharudin. You can read his story now
Thank
at
you.
straitstimes.com or in tomorrow's paper. With Gayatri Murugayan sentenced to 30 years in jail yesterday, it closes a chapter in the Myanmar maid abuse case where 24-year-old Piang Ngai Don was starved and tortured to death. Two other related cases are pending in court involving Gayatri's then-husband as well as her mother. Well, what lessons can we learn from this and recent cases of maid abuse? Let's hear more from Shamsul Kamar, Executive Director of the Centre for Domestic Employees. Welcome to the show, Shamsul. So what has this particular case and, of course, you know, other recent cases taught us, whether it's power dynamics between employer and employee or the necessity of the community to watch out for such abuse cases?
Yes, thank you, Olivia, for having me on the show. I think it's important for us to put things in perspective. I would like to give context and allay the perception that physical abuse of migrant domestic workers is rampant here in Singapore. It is not. And if I may share some figures to all of you, especially MOMs, which shows that the official statistics that we have at the moment is that there are some 250,000 domestic workers here in Singapore. In March this year, MOM reported for the period of around 2017 to 2020, there was about 270 physical abuse cases. So this translates to only about 0.1% of the total migrant domestic worker community in Singapore, if we see it as an average. And out of these, less than half of the complaints warranted enforcement action after the investigations were eventually carried out. Having said that, every case of physical abuse is still one too many. However, what's learned from this, what have we learned, all right, from this issue of migrant domestic abuse that we're talking about recently, all right, I strongly feel is that there is a need whereby in this endeavor, it requires both the individual and a whole society effort to counter this. As a society, we must recognize that our domestic workers are also fellow human beings. And this is something that we need to inculcate to our Singaporeans, create that awareness, even to our children. And many of these workers left the comfort of their homes to work in Singapore and care for our families. They too aspire to secure a better life, a better future for their loved ones. So we strongly advocate for employers to demonstrate empathy, treat their migrant domestic workers as though they are part of the extended household and not to regard them as lesser beings or just someone who are working and are in some way at their disposal, which we worry about this power balance thing. So everyone can play their part, in my view. The public, neighbors, all right, people on the streets, or even shopkeepers who are familiar with the domestic workers, or even medical professionals. Whenever you encounter a migrant domestic worker, pay more attention, all right? Sometimes we can pull out these red flags, like if someone is hurt or injured, or someone goes to the doctor sees that she's got bruises, it is up for us to step forward and make sure that we can help these domestic workers and immediately should they need help, all right? The effort from the public and from society is most important because every issue, if it can be detected early, would be of a great help to our domestic workers. So don't take the bystander effect, where we think somebody else will do it. You know what I mean? It's not my problem. It is a problem or an issue, or rather an endeavor which I think all Singaporeans can own together.
For sure. Well, so you mentioned things that the community can do, like doctors, right? They can report if they observe certain conditions or anything. On the bigger picture, What other systemic measures are necessary, do you think? You know, it was reported in April that the Manpower Ministry will conduct house visits to ensure that domestic helpers are living and working in proper conditions. So besides that, what other similar measures can be put in place?
Yeah. So as I mentioned just now, I think to really address this issue, we require a combination of community interventions as well as systems. And I'm of the view that there are actually many safeguards and laws that adequately protect the interests of our migrant domestic workers. Right? For instance, in one system, if I may share, the Ministry of Manpower actually empowers some service providers to do compulsory settling in program for migrant domestic workers before they are deployed for work. In this program and in these sessions, the domestic workers are actually educated on how and where they can seek help. They're also taught to identify situations where they might be or where they might be compromised or in such ways. And in these programs and in these sessions, they can talk about it. Over the last 5 years, CDE has also complemented some of these efforts, all right? And we have also put in place a whole holistic suite of support services, including touch points to ensure migrant domestic workers know and where or how to seek help. We believe the importance of having systems by the government, but I think NGOs, community interventions are also just equally important. So if I may share briefly, right, CDE has 1,000 volunteers or ambassadors who are on the ground. They act as eyes and ears. They are like the grassroots leaders, all right? And there are many communities all around in Singapore. Their job is to pick up issues on the ground, and if they hear someone is not doing well and so on and so forth, they're actually trained to alert CDE staff officers. And if we need to, we will engage the issue directly. All right. CDE also, as many of you may know, conducts interviews, all right, migrant domestic worker interview privately with every domestic worker that is just been deployed within the first 3 to 6 months of their employment journey. So our endeavor here is to assess if they are coping well with work. We do it in a combination of phone calls or WhatsApp calls to better understand the surrounding workplace that they have, right? And should there be alleged serious offenses, we will address it, we will inform the authorities, and we work on it, all right? So with all this, if I may share, we have also put in all these measures so that our migrant domestic workers feel safe and protected. And we'll continue to work with our government agencies and other industry players, all right, to see how we can better do this so that this holistic endeavor, not just by CDE, also the good work of other NGOs and organizations to ensure make our migrant domestic workers feel safe and protected while they're here in Singapore.
Right. Well, Shamsul, thank you very much for your time today. It was very informative, very insightful, and it has certainly given us a lot of food for thought. I've been speaking with Shamsul Kamar, the Executive Director of the Centre for Domestic Employees. In other news, according to global investment bank Credit Suisse, from 2020 to 2025, the number of millionaires in Singapore could increase by 62%. That's faster than Hong Kong's estimated 60% for the same period, but slower than the growth forecast in mainland China, India, Australia, South Korea and Taiwan. In 2020, Singapore's millionaire density was 5.5%, the second highest in Asia and 11th globally. Overseas, Hong Kong's largest pro-democracy paper, Apple Daily, has announced its closure. After 26 years, it will publish its last edition, quote, no later than Saturday. Apple Daily's officers were raided last week over allegations that several reports had breached the national security law. Company-linked assets were frozen and its chief editor and 5 other executives detained. Founder Jimmy Lai is already in jail on a string of charges. Megan Ravel reports on the paper's rise and fall.
This was the moment 500 officers raided Hong Kong's Apple Daily, a beacon of media freedoms on the margins of communist China.
Don't try to beautify these acts of endangering national security.
It's being widely seen as a direct attack on the city's freewheeling media and has come as a shock to those concerned about the erosion of Hong Kong's freedoms.
It's a political crackdown, and it's also playing some sort of a psychological warfare. And shame on them if this is the way they want to see Hong Kong become.
Apple Daily was set up in 1995 by Jimmy Lai, a self-made textiles tycoon who was jailed in April for joining unauthorised rallies. The splashy Chinese-language tabloid became a runaway commercial success, read by dissidents and a more liberal Chinese diaspora. The paper features a mix of celebrity gossip, investigations of the powerful, and pro-democracy editorials, and is known for repeatedly challenging Beijing's rising authoritarianism. Last year's security law was China's first move to put Hong Kong on an authoritarian path. Apple Daily's advocacy of democratic rights and freedoms has made it a thorn in Beijing's side. Hong Kong's police chief warned in April that media outlets that endanger national security through fake news would be investigated. The newsroom began bracing for a crackdown, reporters have since told Reuters. Most staff received cards with lawyer contacts, and news materials were firewalled or sent abroad to protect information and sources. On June 4th, authorities banned a candlelit vigil in downtown Victoria Park to commemorate the deadly 1989 Tiananmen Square crackdown. Apple Daily's front page the next day read, "You can close Victoria Park, but not lock people's hearts." The raid came on June 17th. Police arrested 5 executives, including chief editor Ryan Law and CEO Chung Kim-hung. Authorities also froze $2.3 million of Apple's assets. 3 days later, the paper marked its 26th anniversary, with merely enough cash left for a few weeks of normal operations. Some observers say the media crackdown could extend beyond Apple, given China's unrelenting drive to wrest control over the city after protests in 2019.
Elsewhere, with just 1 month to the Tokyo Olympics, organisers today unveiled tough new rules for spectators, including a ban on alcohol, hugs, cheers and autographs. Several antivirus requirements like temperature checks and mask wearing apply at the Olympic venues, and those who don't clear them will be denied entry with no refunds. Once inside, spectators are forbidden from making direct contact with other spectators and have to go straight home after events end. Well, you can visit straitstimes.com for more news and videos, and subscribe to our YouTube channel by hitting the red button below. I'm Olivia Quay. See you tomorrow on The Big Story.